You know that feeling. Just completely swamped by health advice. It's everywhere. One expert says one thing, another says the total opposite, and you're just stuck wondering, well, what should I actually do?
Yeah, we definitely get it. And that's kind of why we're here, right?
Yeah,
To do this deep dive.
exactly.
Yeah.
Cut through all that noise, grab the stuff that really matters, and pull out clear, actionable insights you can actually use.
Think of it like getting straight to the source. We're not just, skimming. We're digging into the material itself to get the core ideas and why they matter for you.
And today, we are tackling a big one. Peter Attia's Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity. It's become, well, pretty foundational in this whole longevity conversation. Our mission today, pretty simple. Boil down the key insights, the stuff you can actually take away and use to navigate your own path towards a longer and maybe, more importantly, a healthier life.
Yeah, and Outlive is incredibly thorough. It covers so much ground, from the major diseases of aging, what Attia calls the four horsemen,
Right.
to the real pillars of health: exercise, nutrition, sleep, emotional well-being. He even gets into potential exogenous molecules or medications. We can't cover every single detail today, obviously, but we'll hit the really impactful stuff.
And he gives us this framework, right? The evolution of medicine. Medicine 1.0, 2.0, and now this emerging medicine 3.0.
Exactly. Understanding that progression really helps frame the whole longevity discussion. Medicine 1.0 was, more based on observation, tradition.
No.
Medicine 2.0 brought in the science, clinical trials, evidence-based practice. A huge leap. But Medicine 3.0, that's different.
How so?
It's proactive, for starters. It's personalized. And it thinks long-term, like really long-term, decades, not just fixing today's problem.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting with these four horsemen of aging. What are they and why are they so, well, central to living longer and healthier?
So, the four horsemen, in Attia's terms, are the big chronic diseases that tend to lead to what he calls slow death. We're talking heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, mostly Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes, along with metabolic dysfunction in general.
Those are the big ones.
They are. They're the primary drivers that cut short both lifespan, literally how long you live, and, crucially, health span.
Health span.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a concept he really drills down on. That myth of Tithonus, granted immortality, but not eternal youth.
Right, just aged forever. It perfectly illustrates the point. Just adding years isn't the goal.
It's about the quality of those years. Living well for longer.
Precisely. Lifespan is just the number. Health span is about maintaining your vitality, your physical function, your cognitive abilities, being free from debilitating disease. Attia's definition is even richer. It's about thriving, not just surviving.
Okay, so if these four horsemen are the main threats, what's been the usual medical approach, Medicine 2.0, and why does Attia argue it's, well, not quite cutting it for longevity?
Well, think about it. Medicine 2.0 is fantastic for acute problems. Broken bones, infections, heart attacks as they happen. It's really good at reacting to crises.
Catching the falling egg, as he puts it.
Exactly. It's great at catching the egg right before it splats. But it's been less effective at stopping the egg from falling in the first place, preventing the slow burn of these chronic diseases.
Because the underlying issues, the things causing the egg to fall, they've been building up for a long time, right?
That's the key. These diseases don't just pop up overnight. Heart disease might be developing for 20 years before that sudden heart attack. Cancer can grow silently for ages.
And type 2 diabetes is a classic example of intervening late, isn't it? Waiting for that HbA1c number to hit 6.5%.
Absolutely. By the time your HbA1c is 6.5, your metabolic system is already significantly dysfunctional. The disease process is well established. So Medicine 2.0 tends to react late in the game for these chronic conditions.
Which brings us back to Medicine 3.0.
Yeah.
This proactive, personalized approach. What does that look like in practice?
So instead of just reacting to the rain, Medicine 3.0 is about looking at the forecast. Understanding your individual risks, your genetics, your lifestyle, your biomarkers, and then taking steps now to metaphorically build a better roof, or maybe even a boat.
Getting ahead of the curve. And the personalized part, that sounds like a major shift.
It is. Medicine 2.0 often relies on average results from big trials, but we're all different, aren't we? Medicine 3.0 aims to tailor prevention and treatment to your specific biology and goals.
It also sounds like it puts more responsibility on us, the individuals. We can't just show up and expect a fix.
That's absolutely critical. Medicine 3.0 requires you to be an active participant. You need to be informed, medically literate to some degree, understand your own health goals, and be willing to make changes. You're the co-pilot here.
Attia also talks about the marginal decade. What's that? And how does medicine 2.0 sometimes make it worse?
The marginal decade is that final stretch of life, often marked by increasing frailty and dependence. The potential issue with Medicine 2.0 is that by focusing solely on extending lifespan, sometimes it can inadvertently stretch out that period of being sick and disabled. You live longer, but maybe not better, during those final years.
Whereas centenarians often seem to have a shorter period of decline right at the very end.
Exactly. They often compress their morbidity into a much shorter window before passing away after a very long life. That's kind of the ideal maximizing health span.
So speaking of centenarians, people living to 100 or even supercentenarians past 110, what can they teach us? It seems like they hold some clues.
They absolutely do. Studying these individuals gives us insights into how it's possible to significantly delay or even avoid the major chronic diseases. I mean, supercentenarians are incredibly rare, rarer than billionaires, Adia notes.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're clearly doing something right or possess something unique, genetically or environmentally. Jeanne Calment, living past 122, is just extraordinary.
But it's not as simple as just copying their habits, right? Some smoke or drank.
Right, you can't just pick and choose. They likely had unique genetic protections that allowed them to tolerate certain things. The takeaway isn't necessarily to copy their specific behaviors, but to see that delaying major diseases for decades is biologically possible.
He also mentions this double-edged sword with longevity, particularly for women versus men.
Yeah, there's this observation that women tend to live longer on average, but sometimes experience more years with disability or illness at the end. Men who reach those very old ages often seem to be in better relative health. Adia speculates it might relate to maintaining muscle mass, but it's complex.
And genetics obviously play a part. He uses the APOE gene as an example.
For sure. APOE is a big one, especially regarding Alzheimer's risk. The E4 variant significantly increases risk, while E2 seems protective and is linked to longer life. Knowing your genetics isn't destiny, but it's valuable information for personalizing your strategy in Medicine 3.0.
Okay, so we have disease-specific prevention, but Atia also talks about tackling the aging process itself. Is that actually feasible?
That's a really exciting area of research. The idea is that if you can slow down the fundamental biological processes of aging, you might delay the onset of multiple age-related diseases simultaneously. He mentions interventions like rapamycin, which target some of these core aging pathways.
So two approaches running in parallel, essentially. Prevent specific diseases early and maybe slow down the whole aging clock.
Exactly.
Let's pivot to some specific tactics now. Caloric restriction. The idea that eating less extends life. Where does that come from?
Well, it's an old idea, actually. Attia mentions Luigi Cornaro back in the 15th century, who lived a long life on a very restricted diet, but modern science has put it to the test.
And the results in animals are pretty striking, aren't they?
They really are. Across a whole range of organisms, yeast, worms, flies, mice, even dogs, restricting calories without malnutrition consistently extends lifespan. It seems to trigger some fundamental survival mechanisms.
What's happening at the cellular level? He talks about AMPK and MTRR.
Right. So caloric restriction tends to activate an enzyme called AMPK, which is like a cellular fuel gauge. When energy is low, AMPK ramps up and tells the cell to be more efficient. It also tends to inhibit another pathway called MTOR.
MTOR. That's linked to growth, right?
Yes, MTOR drives cell growth and protein building. When MTOR is less active, cells shift towards maintenance and repair. This includes activating autophagy, basically, cellular housekeeping or recycling. AMPK activation and MTOR inhibition seem key to the benefits.
Autophagy, that self-eating process. Sounds important.
It's crucial. It clears out damaged proteins and old cellular parts. Think of it as tidying up the cell to keep it running smoothly. The research on autophagy even won a Nobel Prize back in 2016. It's a big deal for cellular health and potentially aging.
And rapamycin, that drug you mentioned, also inhibits MTR, similar to caloric restriction.
Exactly. That's one of the main reasons it's generated so much interest in the longevity field. It taps into that same core pathway.
Okay, moving to a really central theme in the book. Metabolic dysfunction. Attia argues it's like a common soil from which many of the four horsemen grow.
He makes a very strong case that poor metabolic health, how our body handles energy, basically is a fundamental driver of heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and obviously type 2 diabetes. It's a root issue.
And he's careful to say it's not just about being overweight.
Absolutely. That's key. You can be metabolically unhealthy at a normal weight, 2FI, thin outside, fat inside. And some people who are overweight can remain metabolically healthy, at least for a while. But the numbers are stark. over 40% obesity in the US, and probably an even higher percentage with underlying metabolic issues.
The liver's role here is massive, isn't it? Especially with blood sugar.
Huge. The liver is constantly juggling glucose, storing it, releasing it to keep our blood sugar in a surprisingly narrow, healthy range. It's a critical player.
And when we take in more energy than we use, we store it as fat. He distinguishes between subcutaneous and visceral fat. Why does that matter?
Subcutaneous fat is the stuff just under the skin, generally less harmful, metabolically speaking. Visceral fat, though, is the fat stored deep in the abdomen, around the organs. That's the metabolically dangerous stuff. It releases inflammatory signals and messes with hormones.
Like a toxic internal fat deposit.
Pretty much. And our capacity to store fat safely, especially subcutaneously, varies. When that safe storage fills up, fat starts spilling over into places it shouldn't, like the liver, the pancreas, and around the organs as visceral fat.
And that fat spillover is a key step towards insulin resistance.
Yes. When fat accumulates where it shouldn't, it interferes with insulin signaling. Cells don't respond as well to insulin, so glucose doesn't get into them easily. Blood sugar starts to rise.
Then the pancreas pumps out more insulin to compensate.
Exactly. It works harder and harder, leading to high insulin levels, hyperinsulinemia, and eventually the pancreas can get exhausted. Plus, fat accumulating in the pancreas makes things even worse. It's a vicious cycle.
And Adia links the explosion of type 2 diabetes historically to our modern diet.
Directly. He points to the massive increase in consumption of refined carbs, processed foods, and especially sugars like fructose, often hidden in things like high fructose corn syrup.
He mentioned something interesting about how humans metabolize fructose differently because of a genetic mutation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We lost the uricase enzyme, which in other animals helps break down uric acid, a byproduct of fructose metabolism. Losing it might have helped our ancestors store fat more easily from fruit, which was good for survival then. But now, with constant access to high amounts of fructose, it makes us very efficient at turning those sugars into fat.
And again, the problem with diagnosing diabetes only when HbA1c hits 6.5.
It's just too late. Significant damage has often already happened. We need to catch metabolic dysfunction much, much earlier.
He points to the insulin spike after eating the postprandial spike as a really early warning sign.
That's a critical insight. How high and how long your insulin stays elevated after a meal can be one of the very first indicators that your system is struggling, even if your fasting glucose or HbA1c look okay. Dr. Gerald Reaven was talking about this decades ago.
Adia even argues that high insulin itself, hyperinsulinemia, should be treated as a major problem, even without high blood sugar.
He does. He views it as a serious endocrine disorder because chronically high insulin drives so many negative processes, inflammation, fat storage, potentially increasing risk for all four horsemen. Addressing it early could be hugely preventative.
Let's switch gears to the first horseman, heart disease. This hits close to home for you, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. Lost two uncles young to heart attacks. And then finding out I had calcium in my own coronary arteries in my mid-30s, that was definitely a wake-up call. It showed me this isn't just an old person's disease.
Adia says it's the most common age-related killer, but also the most preventable.
That's hopeful. It really is. We understand the mechanisms pretty well, and we have tools to intervene. Given that knowledge, the amount of suffering and death from heart disease today is, as Adia puts it, frankly unacceptable.
A big misconception is still dietary cholesterol driving heart disease. Adia pushes back hard on that.
He does, and rightly so. The cholesterol you eat has a relatively small impact on the cholesterol levels in your blood for most people. Our liver makes most of our cholesterol. The focus needs to be elsewhere.
Like the endothelium, that inner lining of the arteries.
Exactly. The endothelium is critical. It's this thin layer of cells, but it controls blood flow, prevents clots, and acts as a barrier. Damage to the endothelium is really where the trouble starts with atherosclerosis.
And atherosclerosis starts when these ApoB particles, LDL, VLDL, get stuck behind that barrier.
That's the model. ApoB is the protein wrapper on LDL and VLDL particles. When these particles get past a damaged or dysfunctional endothelium and into the artery wall, they can get trapped, modified, and trigger an inflammatory immune response. That's the beginning of plaque.
So LDL cholesterol, the standard measurement, isn't the full story. The number of ApoB particles is more important.
LDL-C measures the amount of cholesterol inside the LDL particles. ApoB tells you the number of those particles. Since each particle, regardless of how much cholesterol it's carrying, can potentially get stuck and start plaque, the particle number, ApoB, is arguably a more direct measure of risk. HDL's role is more complex and less about a simple good cholesterol number.
And plaque develops over time, starting soft before it calcifies. This affects how we detect it, like with calcium scores.
Right. Plaque starts soft and fatty. Over time, it can harden and calcify. A calcium scan only sees the calcified stuff. So a score of 0 is good, but it doesn't guarantee you have no plaque. You could still have soft, non-calcified plaque. A CT angiogram can see both types.
So ADA's strategy is basically lower ApoB, and therefore LDL-C, as much as possible, starting much earlier than typical guidelines suggest.
Pretty much. The logic is atherosclerosis is cumulative. It builds over decades. By keeping ApoB levels very low ideally, like those seen in healthy children starting early, you dramatically reduce the lifelong exposure of your arteries to these plaque-initiating particles. The standard 10-year risk calculation just doesn't capture that long timeline.
And achieving that often involves lifestyle, like healthier fats, but also medications like statins or PCSK9 inhibitors.
Yeah, lifestyle is a foundational shifting towards unsaturated fats, etc. But to get to the very low levels ATIA advocates for, many people, maybe most, will need medication. Statins are the workhorse, helping the liver clear LDL. PCSK9 inhibitors are powerful newer drugs that can lower LDL even further.
Okay, so the takeaway for heart disease is early, aggressive, long-term prevention. Let's move to cancer, the second horseman. Two main goals here.
Simple in concept. 1, don't get cancer. 2, if you do, catch it as absolutely early as possible.
The Cancer Genome Atlas project mapped cancer genes, but it showed things were more complicated than hoped.
Yeah, it revealed incredible complexity and variation between and even within tumor types. No simple cancer gene for most common cancers. It made finding universal targets harder.
He mentions the Warburg effect, cancer cells using energy differently. Is that a weak spot?
Potentially. Cancer cells often rely heavily on glycolysis, even with oxygen around. It's inefficient for energy, but great for producing building blocks for rapid growth. This unique metabolism might be something we can target.
And maybe why things like caloric restriction or fasting mimicking diets show some promise alongside standard treatments.
There's definitely interest there. The idea is that restricting energy or specific nutrients might stress cancer cells metabolically, making them more vulnerable to chemo or radiation. It's still early days for much of this in humans, but it's an active research area.
Immunotherapy has been a game changer, hasn't it? Training our own immune system.
Huge breakthroughs. Checkpoint inhibitors that unleash the immune system, CRRT therapies that engineer immune cells to hunt cancer. It's revolutionized treatment for certain cancers.
Early detection is key. Screening helps, but there are debates, like with colonoscopies or PSA tests.
Screening is vital, but it's nuanced. How often for colonoscopies? When to start? PSA for prostate cancer can find slow-growing cancers that might never cause harm, leading to overtreatment. It requires careful, personalized discussion about risks and benefits.
And liquid biopsies, finding tumor DNA in blood, that sounds revolutionary for early detection.
It really could be. Detecting tiny amounts of cancer DNA shed into the bloodstream could allow for much earlier diagnosis, monitoring treatment response, catching recurrence. It's not quite prime time for universal screening yet, but the potential is enormous.
Okay, horseman number 3. Neurodegenerative diseases, mainly Alzheimer's. Chasing memory, as Attia puts it. What's the current thinking on Alzheimer's?
Well, the hallmarks are still amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain. They disrupt nerve cell function, but why they build up and their exact role, cause, or consequence is still heavily debated.
And drugs targeting amyloid haven't really delivered the knockout punch people hoped for.
Largely, no. Many trials targeting amyloid removal haven't shown clear cognitive benefits, which has fueled the debate about the underlying causes and shifted focus towards other factors and, importantly, prevention.
Prevention seems key. He mentions the finger trial, showing lifestyle changes can make a difference.
Yes, the finger trial was significant. It showed that a multi-pronged approach, diet, exercise, cognitive training, managing vascular health, could protect cognitive function in older adults at risk. It provides real hope for prevention through lifestyle.
And the urgency for prevention is high because once dementia sets in, options are limited, right?
Tragically, yes. We have no cure and very limited treatments once significant cognitive decline occurs. Prevention, starting potentially decades earlier, is absolutely paramount for neurodegenerative diseases.
So what are the main preventative levers Attia pulls out?
Several key ones. First, metabolic health, again, insulin resistance seems strongly linked. Ketogenic diets are mentioned as a potential way to provide alternative brain fuel. Second, exercise, both cardio fitness, VO2 max, and strength, like grip strength, are strongly protective. Third, reducing inflammation, surprisingly, things like good oral hygiene seem to matter.
Oral hygiene,
Yeah.
like flossing, linked to Alzheimer's.
Sounds weird, but yeah, gum disease bacteria can cause systemic inflammation, and chronic inflammation is increasingly implicated in Alzheimer's. Shows how interconnected everything is.
And the fourth preventative strategy.
Sleep. Absolutely critical. Prioritizing good quality sleep is essential for brain health and clearing out waste products, potentially including amyloid.
Okay, let's shift to part 3 of the book, Thinking Tactically. Building that framework. Use a car accident analogy.
Yeah, it's about recognizing risks and having specific tactics to mitigate them. Just like defensive driving, wearing seatbelts reduces your risk in a car, specific health tactics reduce your risk from the four horsemen and aging.
And he breaks it down into 5 tactical domains: exercise, nutrition, sleep, emotional health, and these exogenous molecules. We've touched on nutrition and sleep. Let's dig into exercise more. Cardio versus weights. What's his take?
Both. Absolutely both are non-negotiable. He emphasizes zone 2 cardio, that steady state conversational pace for mitochondrial health and building aerobic base. And strength training is critical for building and maintaining muscle and bone density, which plummet otherwise.
He has this cool concept, the centenarian decathlon. What's that about?
It's a brilliant framing device. It's about defining the 10 physical tasks you want to be able to do in your 90s or beyond to maintain independence and quality of life. Not actual Olympic events, but things like carrying groceries, getting off the floor, playing with grandkids, hiking.
So you train backwards from those goals.
Exactly. You figure out what physical capacity you need for your personal decathlon events and train specifically to build and maintain that capacity throughout your life.
And VO2 max comes up, again, as a huge predictor of longevity.
One of the strongest, yeah. Improving your VO2 max, your body's ability to use oxygen, requires pushing yourself, often with interval training going harder than zone 2 periodically.
And muscle mass sarcopenia, the loss with age. Why is fighting that so vital?
Muscle isn't just for strength. It's metabolically active, crucial for glucose disposal, supports your skeleton, prevents falls. We lose it starting surprisingly early, maybe our 30s, and it's hard to get back later. Consistent strength training is essential defense.
The same for bone density, right? Preventing fractures.
Definitely. Weight-bearing exercise is key. Lifting weights, running, even walking. He's also a fan of walking with a weighted pack as an effective way to load the skeleton and build bone density.
He also mentions stability training, breathing, things often overlooked.
Super important. Stability is foundational for moving well and preventing injury. He talks about DNS, PRI principles focusing on core stability, proper movement patterns, and breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing is key for core stability and nervous system regulation.
Even foot and hand health.
Yep. Your feet are your connection to the ground, vital for balance and force transfer. Hand grip strength is a powerful health marker, but hand dexterity matters too. It's all connected.
Okay, let's wade into nutrition. It's confusing out there. He's pretty critical of a lot of nutrition research, especially epidemiology.
He is, and he explains why. Observational studies are just plagued by confounding factors. People who eat healthy often do lots of other healthy things, the healthy user bias. It's really hard to prove cause and effect. Dr. Ioannidis has written scathing critiques about this field.
And he distinguishes efficacy works in a lab versus effectiveness works in real life.
Crucial distinction. A diet might look great in a controlled trial where everyone follows it perfectly, but does it work long-term when real people with real lives try to follow it? Adherence is everything in nutrition.
He does mention the pre-DMID study on the Mediterranean diet as being relatively strong.
Yeah, because it was a randomized intervention trial. They actually gave people olive oil or nuts, and it showed reduced cardiovascular events compared to a low-fat control group. That's stronger evidence than just observation.
So, boiling down his practical advice, what are the key nutritional principles? Energy balance seems foundational.
Absolutely. Step 1 is don't consistently eat more calories than you expend. We live in this crisis of abundance, especially with the standard American diet SAD full of hyperpalatable, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods. Avoiding chronic overconsumption is job 1.
Then there are different ways to achieve dietary restriction: DR, calorie counting, fasting, cutting food groups.
Right. Various tools. Calorie counting works but can be tedious. Intermittent fasting limits when you eat. Cutting carbs or fat limits what you eat. Each has pros and cons, and adherence is always the main challenge.
Glucose control is another big focus. Avoiding those big blood sugar spikes. CGMs help here.
Massively. Seeing your glucose response in real time with a continuous glucose monitor helps you understand how specific foods, exercise, stress, sleep, how they all impact your blood sugar. The goal is flatter, more stable glucose levels.
Protein, he thinks the standard RDA is too low, especially for aging and muscle.
Yeah, he argues the RDA is just enough to prevent deficiency, but not optimal for building and maintaining muscle, particularly as we age. He advocates for higher intake, focusing on quality sources to support muscle protein synthesis.
Fats, the message seems to be. More monounsaturated, olive oil, avocados, and omega-3s, fish, less omega-6s, and maybe saturated fats.
That's the general direction. Emphasize MUFAs and omega-3 PUFAs. Reduce omega-6s from processed vegetable oils. Saturated fat is nuanced, but moderation is probably wise for most. Limiting trans fats is a given.
And meal timing, time-restricted feeding, more than just calorie restriction.
Potentially. Some evidence suggests benefits for insulin sensitivity and circadian rhythms, separate from just eating less overall. But human data is still evolving, and you have to be careful not to restrict too much and lose muscle or miss nutrients.
Okay, domain 4, sleep. Eddie is pretty evangelical about this now, after neglecting it himself.
He really is. He learned the hard way. He now calls it non-negotiable. It's crucial for everything: physical repair, cognitive function, metabolic health, emotional regulation.
Right.
Evolution wouldn't have kept it if it wasn't vital.
And the target is roughly 7.5 to 8.5 hours for most adults. The consequences of falling short are significant.
Huge. Increased injury risk, worse performance, athletic and mental, messed up metabolism, insulin resistance, higher cortisol, higher risk of heart disease, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. The list goes on.
He mentions the sleep cycle, deep sleep, REM sleep, and that deep sleep declines with age.
Yeah, we cycle through light NREM, deep NREM, and REM. That deep slow wave sleep is incredibly restorative, and we tend to get less of it as we get older, which is a problem we need to try and mitigate.
He's not a big fan of sleep meds long term.
Generally, no. They might knock you out, but often don't provide truly restorative sleep architecture. Plus potential side effects and dependence. Better to fix the underlying sleep hygiene issues.
So assessing habits, maybe with trackers cautiously, and focusing on the basics.
Right. Trackers can give data, but don't obsess over scores. Focus on consistent schedule, dark, cool, quiet room, winding down before bed, limiting screens blue light, watching caffeine alcohol timing, managing stress. Knowing your chronotype helps too. And if you really can't sleep, get out of bed for a bit.
Okay, finally, the 5th domain, and one Adia gets very personal about emotional health.
Yeah, his story is incredibly raw and powerful. A family crisis highlighted his own emotional shortcomings and forced him to confront that aspect of his health. It's a profound realization that physical health isn't enough.
He argues it's just as critical for longevity and a meaningful life.
Absolutely. He points to the tragic rise in deaths of despair from substance abuse and suicide. Emotional well-being and physical health are completely intertwined. Unresolved emotional issues can sabotage physical health goals.
And we tend to avoid dealing with this stuff. He talks about trauma.
Yeah, the hard stuff. Trauma abuse, neglect, abandonment, even enmeshment can leave deep scars that drive current behaviors like anger, addiction, or avoidance. He critiques the standard diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, for sometimes labeling symptoms without addressing root causes like trauma.
So therapeutic work was key for him, identifying core beliefs, learning regulation skills.
Hugely transformative by his account. Things like cognitive reframing, understanding his own patterns. He mentions DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which teaches skills for emotion regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness. It's about building an emotional toolkit.
The core message being vulnerability, seeking help, and prioritizing this alongside diet and exercise.
Exactly. You can have the best diet and exercise plan in the world, but if you're emotionally unwell, suffering in your relationships, what's the point of living longer?
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in just from the initial concepts. As we wrap up this first part of our deep dive into Outlive, what's the big takeaway?
I think the main message is that longevity real health span isn't about finding one magic bullet. It's about a consistent, proactive, personalized strategy across all these domains: exercise, nutrition, sleep, and crucially, emotional health. And starting early.
Right. It's not a quick fix. It's an ongoing process, a long game. Learning, adapting.
Absolutely. Science evolves, you evolve. It requires engagement, curiosity, and a willingness to adjust course based on what you learn about yourself and the science.
So the power really is in our hands to influence our health span,
Yeah.
to take control by being informed.
Definitely. It's empowering. You're not just a passive recipient of fate or genetics. You can actively shape your health trajectory towards not just a longer life, but a better one.
Okay, so here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Based on everything we've just discussed, what's one small, manageable change you could make starting today that moves you even slightly closer towards that goal of a longer, healthier life? Don't try to overhaul everything at once, just one intentional step. What will it be?